London Property, home of Super Prime, where you can find informative, educational and entertaining content covering all aspects of property.
Hello and welcome to London Property, the home of Super Prime. I'm your host Farnaz Fazaipour, and today we're in conversation with Tom Jefferies, an authority on the subject of leasehold enfranchisement. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, nice to be here.
So Tom, tell us about yourself and what you do in this space.
Well, I'm a property litigation barrister. I've been practicing for about 40 years now. And back in the 1990s, I found myself getting involved in leasehold enfranchisement. And I found it a really interesting topic. There's lots of law, valuation, and you get to snoop around lots of really interesting houses in nice areas and meet lots of very interesting people. So it's snowballed, and I've done more and more cases, and now I'm one of the specialists in this area.
Fantastic. Well, we're very pleased to be speaking to you today, and today we're going to focus on tenant improvements. So should we start by you telling us what are tenant improvements when it comes to leasehold enfranchisement?
Well, people talk about home improvements, which covers just about everything you do to your house, but not everything you do is what's legally categorised as an improvement. So if you just redecorate your house, or you change the bathroom fittings, you don't like the avocado ones and you change it to a different colour, that's just repairs or replacing what's there. But if you do something that changes it significantly, like changing the layout or installing a new bathroom or air conditioning, that counts as an improvement. It adds to the property from the point of view of the tenant, and from a valuation point of view, it makes the flat property worth more. So that's an improvement.
And how does the tenant improvement affect the valuation process for enfranchisement?
Well, the starting point is the tenant has to effectively pay for the value of the landlord's interest in the property. The starting point is you value what you see. You value the flat as it stands at the valuation date, which is when you serve your notice. But that can be very unfair on the tenant. If I've spent £1 million doing up my flat, putting in air conditioning, fancy new floors, state-of-the-art bathroom and so on, that adds to the value. So it's seen as unfair on the tenant that he should not only pay for all that work, but then have to pay the additional value. In all the valuations, tenants' improvements are disregarded. So you have to value the flat as if the work had not been done. So you imagine it on the valuation date as if it didn't have the changed layout, it didn't have the air conditioning and so on.
Gosh, I imagine leaving things to imagination must open up a whole host of other issues. Can you also ignore the scope for that work to be done?
Well, that's a question that came up in about 2005 in a case called Fatal, all about a house in Hamilton Terrace, one of the most litigated streets in London, I think, where there was a house, 19th century house, which started out at 3,000 square feet, and the tenant had built on top of it, behind it, and by the valuation date, it was 9,000 square feet, with the benefit of planning permission for all that additional work. And everyone agreed you had to disregard that and value the 3,000 square foot house that had been there before. But then the question was, well, what can you assume about the scope to add to it? And the tenant said, well, you just have to value it as a 3,000 square feet house. And the landlord said, no, you have to take account of the fact that the planning permission was granted, allowing all this extra work, and you have to you have to allow for the additional value of the scope to carry out that additional work. and the Lands Tribunal agreed with the landlord and said, no, you don't disregard the planning permission, and you have to have regard to the value of adding all that extra floor space. So typically what you do is you take the finished value, the gross development value, and you deduct the cost of carrying out all the work and allow for profit and risks and things like that. So you end up with what's called the site value. And in that case, it was 25%. So yes, you disregard all the additional value created by the work, but you allow for the possibility of doing that work, which in that case worked out about 25% of the actual value that was created.
Okay, because you also have this in the Grosvenor estate, don't you, with the air rights above properties. So I guess when you're going for freeholds there, you have to account for that as well?
Well, Grosvenor try and exclude the airspace, and lots of people let them get away with it, but you shouldn't, because they're not entitled to retain the airspace. But they do it because they want to hang on to the development value, and if you come along and you want to build an extra story, they'll want half the added value.
Gosh. So on the subject, can you tell us about the Alberti case and how is that relevant in this topic?
Well, yes. Well, that followed on from the Fatal case. That was a case earlier this year about a house in Cheney Walk originally owned by Gerald Scarfe, the cartoonist. And he bought it as an old house converted into 5 flats. He converted it back into a single house. And at the time, you didn't need planning permission for the work, the conversion work. He should have got planning permission for change of use back to a single house, but he didn't get it. After 4 years, you're immune from enforcement anyway, so it became a lawful, what's called the established use of the building. Roll forward to 2014, and Kensington were getting alarmed at the loss of all the so many flats, because it was increasingly popular to turn flats back into houses and create big mansions for people, which were immensely valuable. So Kensington tightened up so that you needed planning permission to turn flats back into a house. And what's more, they had a policy of resisting planning permission if you were going to lose more than one flat. So for this house, the Gerald Scarfe's house, after 2014, everyone agreed you would not get permission to turn it back into a house, even though in fact it was being used as a house. So then you get to the valuation, and of course, in fact, it was a house with permitted use as a house. It was common ground. You had to disregard the work, so you had to value it physically as 5 flats. But
even though the time had lapsed and it was...
Yes, because you had to disregard the physical work converting it back to a house. So you had to imagine there was a building comprising five flats.
Okay.
But the question was what assumption you can make about the potential use. Because if it had, in fact, it had established use for planning as a house. Well, if you valued it with that potential, then you could convert it back to a house. Whereas if you had to ignore that established use, then we know you wouldn't get planning permission, so you had to value it as flats. And it was worth at least £2 million more if you could turn it back into a house than if you had to disregard the established use. So the question was whether you could ignore, whether you should disregard that established use. And the landlord's argument was, well, look at that Fatal case. They didn't disregard the planning permission, so it would be odd if you disregarded the established use. And they said, all you have to disregard is the work, nothing else. And there's no unfairness to the tenant because he didn't pay for the established use, and he didn't pay for the fact that Kensington had changed its planning policies. That's just a quirk of history. And it would be very unfair to the landlord if they lost all that uplift in value. But that argument didn't work, and the tribunal said, well, you have to disregard the work, and you have to disregard it for all purposes. You have to assume it had never happened. And so you have to disregard all the consequences of the work not having been done. So if the work hadn't been done, it had remained as 5 flats, it would never have got established use as a house. So you also had to disregard the established use, because that only came about because of the work that was done enabling it to be used as a house. So the tenant did very well in that case and got the benefit of a greatly reduced price. The landlord is trying to appeal to the Supreme Court, so that may not be the last word on that particular one.
And what do you think the implications of this case are?
Well, the case itself is quite unusual, that particular set of facts, but a much more common scenario, which it has implications for, is where you have a planning permission. Say you got planning permission. I did a case like this earlier this year, where planning permission had been granted back in the 90s to build an extra story on top of the flats, and they duly carried out the work. So it was common ground. You had to disregard the work, but what about the planning permission? Well, you can't disregard the fact of the planning permission because the planning permission was granted before the work was carried out. So it wasn't a result of the work. But, and this is the normal case, planning permissions have to be implemented within 3 years, and you can only implement them by carrying out development work which is referable to the planning permission. So if you didn't do the work building the extra story, you have to imagine you didn't do that work. You also have to imagine you hadn't implemented the planning permission. So that planning permission, yes, it's there as part of the history, but it's spent. And in that case, as in many others, planning policies have changed. And the planning evidence was, in that case, you would not now get planning permission for the same work. So you disregard, in that case, you had to disregard the scope for doing the work, as well as the fact that it had been done. So that's one implication. And then also you have to start thinking about licenses for alterations. Most of these cases, you need a landlord's license for alterations. And if it's a very simple one, you don't disregard it. So it might still be capable of being implemented. But in many cases, the license says you have to complete the work within a certain period. So if you haven't done the work and you haven't implemented the license, does it lapse? Do you need fresh consent again from the landlord? So there you have another risk factor. Would the landlord actually get consent in the sort of hypothetical, imaginary scenario we're talking about? So that depends on the terms of the license in the particular case. But that's, that's another interesting implication of the Alberti case. So in broad terms, it's going to help tenants. It's going to reduce the price payable where you've got significant alterations which needed planning permission.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, in the case that you just referred to, the planning permission was granted, the works were done, but because you've got to disregard, you imagine that the works were not done, the planning permission wasn't granted. Whereas in the Hamilton Terrace one, there was planning permission, the works hadn't been done yet, but you're still paying for the benefit of the works to be done.
No, what they said in Fatal was, you don't disregard the fact that the planning permission was granted. And in the case I talked about, likewise, you don't disregard the fact that planning permission was granted, but like all planning permissions, it's subject to a number of conditions. It has to be implemented. It has to be started within 3 years. And if you don't start it, it lapses. So it's no longer available. So that's what happened in my case, and that's what will happen in most cases. If the work was done more than 3 years ago, if the planning permission was more than 3 years old, chances are it won't be available anymore.
Even though you've done the work.
Even though you've done the work. So you imagine the work has been done.
Yeah.
And then you know there was a planning permission, say 5 years ago, but you will assume that planning permission has lapsed. So you will need a fresh planning permission. Now, in a simple case, it may be obvious you get planning permission in an uncontroversial case. But where planning policies have changed, then you may well no longer get the planning permission. So you disregard the scope to do the work
if planning has changed.
Would no longer be available. Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
So that gets you an even bigger reduction.
So it sounds like there's a lot of business to be done for pre-planning applications here for both sides. If somebody's going to say you won't get it or you will get it, then the other party can go within 3 weeks, try and get some certainty on whether it will happen or it won't happen.
Yeah, I mean, where you have arguments about whether you get planning permission, it's you quite often get a planning expert, but the simplest way is to go approach the council and do a pre-app, as you say, and see what the council says. But you tend only to do that if you're pretty confident what the answer is going to be. I mean, if you're a landlord, you will, and you're trying to emphasise you would get planning permission, you go and get some pre-app advice if you're confident that you would get it. So you can say, because on the valuation, you have to imagine a hypothetical sale at the valuation date of the notice. And you say, well, the imaginary purchaser, would he be thinking, oh yes, I can build this extra story. I better check planning. I will go and do a pre-app at the council. And then the landlord produces the actual pre-app to show the tribunal and say, well, this is the response he would have got. So he would be confident he could do the work.
Gosh, it's no wonder you find it so fascinating because, we think, okay, if all the leases on all these big estates are going down, what's next? But there's so much more to keep interpreting and exploring, isn't it, in this subject?
Yeah, I mean, the issues change sort of every couple of years. The issues change. You had arguments about deferment rate, then you had arguments about the value to stay at the end of a long lease, and in the last few years, I'd say over half of my work has been about development value. And even though the estates have sold off most of their estates, there's still a lot of cases about development value, in particular, the ability to build on top of existing buildings. Because as you know, there are now permitted development rights to build on top. So quite often the tenants are worried that their building qualifies. They're worried the landlord might try and build extra flats. No tenants want that to happen. So they claim the freehold and make a collective enfranchisement claim. And then you end up with an argument about development value. And the landlord says, well, I've got potential to build an extra 2-4 flats on the top of this building, and that's worth an extra few $100,000 or $1 million or whatever it might be. And the tenants will say, no, there's no such value because you wouldn't get planning, the building's not strong enough, and so on. I mean, I did a case about just that earlier this year. We've just got the result out. So I've done, I don't know, a dozen of those sort of cases now, both for landlords and tenants. So that is a very common form of dispute that goes on now, where you've got blocks of flats.
And then the counter argument would be to actually see whether it's, from an engineering perspective, it's actually possible, I suppose. So then you have to figure that out in order to argue with your landlord, well, actually, the foundations won't hold it.
Yes, exactly. Is the building strong enough?
Yeah.
I mean, you get 1930s blocks of flats. They were often not particularly sturdy build. So sometimes there's an issue about that. By and large, you can put a lightweight structure on top. But you can end up with a raft of experts, planning experts, engineering experts, quantity surveyors, valuers. It can cost a fortune to argue these cases, which is fine if there's a lot of value in it, but it can just eat up the amount at stake.
We've had the white paper and the recommendations and all of that is pending some changes. Are you worried about any of those, or do you think any of them are really good news and they're going to open up another whole host of arguments?
There's bound to be even more litigation as and when the new legislation comes in, because it's going to be wholly new, and there'll be limitless new things to argue about. It'll be like the 1990s all over again.
It's going to be that big, you think?
So yeah, I mean, they're undertaking a huge task trying to rewrite all the legislation. So there are bound to be issues about what the words they use mean.
So as a barrister of leasehold enfranchisement, traditionally you had to be instructed by a solicitor. And can you just talk to us about how that's changed and how our listeners could get your expertise?
Well, that's changed because they first of all changed the rules so we could be instructed by professionals, such as, in this case, surveyors. A lot of my work comes from surveyors who know me, so introduce me to their clients. But then they changed it again, so now I can work directly with members of the public, and I'm very, very happy to do that. And with this sort of work, most of the people I deal with are very well-informed, smart people who can give me the information I need, and I'm very happy to work with them directly.
So it's a really good first step for people, as you say, who are already quite savvy in the subject, when they're trying to make a decision, to just say, okay, I'm just going to pass this by you. What do you think? Shall I go this way or that way?
Yeah, if you've got a tricky issue, yes, that's right. Yeah.
We've talked about how tenant improvements affect the valuation process. Can you tell us, in your opinion, what are the do's and don'ts for a tenant to consider?
The advice I'd give tenants, I mean, if you're is first of all, make sure you keep records of any work you do, particularly if you do anything substantial. Keep plans of the flat or the building before and after you do the work. Keep photographs, keep invoices, because all this is important, because the burden is on the tenant to prove that the tenant has actually done all the work at their own expense. And if you're buying a flat which has been greatly improved, and you might want to extend the lease, likewise, ask the vendor for records of the work they've carried out, because you can get the benefit of the disregard of the work your predecessors carried out. So you want to be able to prove all that. If there was a license for alterations, ask for the plans, photos, invoices, all that sort of thing. Don't despair if none of that is available. And quite often, if you have, all you have is, like one I'm looking at recently, you have a lease plan from 1989 showing one layout. You go and look at it now, and it's got a bathroom in a different place. So normally, the tribunal's happy just to infer that the tenant, at the time being, did the work, because who else would do it, and why would they want to spend the money on it? But there can sometimes be room for questioning that, whether it was done before or after the lease was granted, say. So that's why it's important to have all these records to be able to prove what was done.
So since we live in a world of imagination, can you also say, well, hang on a minute, that was before 1993, you had no rights anyway?
No, that's
that's a step too far.
No,
and is most of your work for tenants, or is it tenants, landlords?
It's a mixture.
It's a mixture.
Yes,
so do you have any do's and don'ts for landlords?
Well, I'd say to the landlord, do go and inspect the property now and then, so that you can see what's going on, because you do quite often get cases of tenants carrying out unauthorised alterations that you may not be aware of. It may be you could have charged for them, and if you don't discover them and the tenant claims a lease extension, you may find you're not getting all the benefit you could have done had you been asked for consent. So go and check every few years. Every few
years, because after 4 years it becomes...
Check the condition of the property. So you can take action if you need to, if something unauthorised has been done.
So, Tom, thank you very much for talking to us and giving us a glimpse into a very interesting world of leasehold enfranchisement. And for our listeners, you can head over to our experts directory to get in touch with Tom directly, or if you're looking for any other experts to help you with your real estate needs, then our Need to Know experts can be found in the directory.
Thanks for listening to the London Property Podcast. Head over to londonproperty.co.uk and subscribe to our newsletter to receive latest updates.